The Harrow House Estate, late October. The water is colder than it looks. I am Judith Parker, and I am drowning in silk while my sister laughs from the dry edge of the pool. To the guests recording on their phones, this looks like a humiliating accident at a six-figure wedding. But they don't know who paid for the champagne they are drinking. They don't know who owns the mansion they are standing on. They pushed me in to mock me, never suspecting that the woman in the water holds the deed, the checkbook, and the power to end their entire world before the band stops playing. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. Here is the story of how I took back my name. The water was colder than it looked. That was the first thing my brain registered, the shock of the temperature, then the heavy, suffocating weight of $3,000 worth of periwinkle silk dragging me down. The sound of the jazz band, which had been playing a soft, innocuous cover of a pop song, warped into a garbled underwater drone. I kicked my heels, scraping against the rough plaster of the pool floor, and broke the surface, gasping. The air hit my face, but the humiliation hit harder. Chlorine burned my eyes, mixing with the mascara that was already streaming down my cheeks. Through the blur, I saw them, a sea of pastel dresses and linen suits, all frozen in a tableau of grotesque delight. And the phones. That was the detail that stuck with me, the detail that made my stomach turn over in a knot of cold dread. There must have been 50 of them, raised like lighter flames at a concert, the black eyes of the camera lenses fixed on me. They weren't rushing to help. They were recording. My sister Sloane stood at the edge of the coping, her hand still hovering in the space where my shoulder had been a second ago. She was laughing, that tinkling practice sound she used to charm waiters and board members alike. She looked perfect, dry, immaculate, in white lace backlit by the late afternoon sun, like an avenging angel. "Oh my God, Jude!" she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest in a performance that wouldn't have convinced a toddler. "I barely touched you. You're so dramatic." I wiped the water from my eyes, my hair plastered to my skull, looking up at the people who were supposed to be my family. My father Richard was swirling his scotch, looking vaguely annoyed that the schedule had been interrupted. But it was my mother Eleanor who delivered the blow that actually drew blood. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She stepped to the edge of the pool, her heels clicking on the travertine, and leaned down just enough for me to hear her over the ripple of nervous laughter from the guests. "For God's sake, Judith," she hissed, her lips barely moving. "Don't make this about you. Not today." I looked past her towards the head table. That's when I saw him. Grant Hale, the groom, the CEO. He was standing with his hands in the pockets of his tuxedo trousers, watching me struggle to find purchase on the slippery tiles. He was smiling. It wasn't a malicious smile exactly. It was the smile of a man watching a clumsy waiter drop a tray. A mixture of pity and amusement, detached and superior. He looked untouchable. He looked like he owned the world, or at least this estate. And that was the thought that finally made my blood hot enough to combat the chill of the water. I looked at Grant gleaming in the golden hour light, and a single dangerous question crystallized in my mind. If he's the CEO, why does he look like an employee the moment I stand up, to understand why I didn't climb out of that pool and strangle my sister right then and there? You have to understand the architecture of the Parker family. It was a structure built entirely on load-bearing lies. From the time we were children, the roles were assigned with the rigidity of a caste system. Sloane was the golden child. She was beautiful, charismatic, and completely allergic to accountability. If Sloane broke a vase, it was because the vase was placed precariously. If Sloane failed a class, the teacher was incompetent. My parents viewed her as their avatar, the physical manifestation of the status they felt they deserved. I, on the other hand, was the practical one. That's the polite term they used in public. In private, I was the fixer, the buffer. I was the one who remembered birthdays, the one who double-checked the tax returns, the one who learned to sew so I could fix the hems of Sloane's dresses before her pageants. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, operated on a simple binary worldview: titles equal value, and appearances equal morality. If you look successful, you were good. If you were quiet and diligent, you were merely useful. I learned very early on that visibility in this family was a trap. If you did something well, they took credit for it. If you made a mistake, you were the scapegoat. So I developed a coping strategy that eventually became a lifestyle. I became invisible. I became boring. I stopped sharing my grades, my interests, and eventually my ambitions. They thought I was drifting. They thought I was struggling to find my footing in the real world, while Sloane was busy being groomed for a high society marriage. They didn't know that while they were obsessing over country club memberships, they couldn't afford I was building something. It started in college with a piece of software. I developed a supply chain logistics algorithm that wasn't sexy but was essential. I didn't slap my name on it. I didn't want the Parker name anywhere near it. I had seen how my parents treated money. They viewed it as a finite resource to be hunted and consumed, not grown. If they knew I had money, they would drain me dry and then criticize me for not having more. So I incorporated through a blind trust. That trust owned a holding LLC, which in turn owned the corporation. My name appeared on nothing public. To the world, and specifically to my family, I was Judith Parker, the freelance consultant who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 4-year-old sedan. To the IRS and a very small circle of attorneys, I was the majority shareholder of a company that had quietly revolutionized how mid-sized manufacturers moved goods across the Midwest. I built a fortress of paper to keep them out. I learned that silence wasn't just a shield, it was a vault. But the problem with building a vault is that eventually you have to come out. Or in my case, you get invited to a wedding that threatens to tear the vault door off its hinges. The announcement had come 6 months ago. My mother had summoned me to their rented condo. They were always between estates, with the air of a monarch bestowing a favor. Sloane is getting married. She had announced, tears of joy welling in her eyes that never quite spilled over. To Grant Hale, he's a CEO, Judith, a tech CEO. I knew Grant Hale. Or rather, I knew of him. He was the figurehead for a startup that had been making noise in the industry, lots of buzzwords, very little profit. He was charming, handsome, and exactly the kind of empty suit my parents worshipped. We're going to give them the wedding they deserve, my father had declared, chest puffing out. A 6-figure affair. The family estate. It's going to be the event of the season. A once-in-a-lifetime celebration. I remember sitting there sipping lukewarm tea doing the mental math. My parents were leveraged to the hilt. They barely had 5 figures, let alone 6. And the family estate. That was a phrase they loved to toss around, referring to a sprawling historic mansion on the coast that we had visited for summers. They spoke of it as if it were ancestral land passed down through generations. The truth was far murkier, and they preferred it that way. They loved the implication of ownership without the burden of the deed. That sounds ambitious, I had said, carefully neutral. Don't be jealous, Judith, Sloane had chimed in, flashing a ring that looked heavy enough to cause a repetitive stress injury. Just because you're still figuring things out doesn't mean you can't be happy for me. We expect you to help, of course, my mother added, her tone sharpening. Not financially, obviously. We know you can't afford it, but with the logistics, you're good at the boring stuff. I accepted the role because it gave me access. I became the point person for the vendors, the caterers, the security teams. And that's when I saw the disaster looming. My parents were booking services they had zero intention or ability to pay for. They were writing checks that were destined to bounce higher than a satellite. I saw the contracts. I saw the deposits. I saw the ruin of small business owners who thought they were dealing with old money and were actually dealing with professional grifters. I couldn't let that happen. Not because I wanted to save my parents from embarrassment, I was long past that, but because I couldn't stomach the collateral damage. The florists, the musicians, the waitstaff. They didn't deserve to be casualties of the Parker ego. So I made a move. I set up a neutral entity, a generic-sounding foundation funded by my holding company. I contacted every vendor individually. I told them there had been a change in billing for tax purposes. I set up a vendor escrow. Every single dime for this dream wedding came out of my pocket, filtered through layers of corporate anonymity. My parents didn't notice. They didn't care who paid as long as they didn't have to, and as long as they got the credit. When the vendors stopped hounding them for deposits, they just assumed their charm had worked, or that Grant had taken care of it, or that the universe was finally providing what they were owed. They were so absorbed in their own narrative that they never stopped to ask why the invoices were stamped paid before they even opened their checkbook. Then came the invitation. It arrived in my mailbox on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the calligraphy embossed in gold leaf. Inside, tucked behind the RSVP card, was a small handwritten note from my mother. Judith, please try to look presentable. And please don't start anything. We want this day to be perfect for Sloan. It was a warning, a reminder of my place. Come watch, applaud, and disappear. I sat in my modest apartment holding that card. I could have thrown it away. I could have stayed home, let the checks clear, and let them have their fantasy, while I stayed safe in my reality. I could have ghosted them. God knows I wanted to. I wanted to cut the cord and let them drift away into the ocean of debt and delusion they had created. But then, I thought about Grant Hale, the CEO who didn't know who signed his paychecks. I thought about the family estate that my parents were parading around as their own. I thought about the vendors who were only being paid because I existed. I realized that if I didn't go, the lie would become the truth. They would rewrite history, erasing me completely while standing on the foundation I paid for. I picked up my phone and texted my lawyer, Mari. I'm going. Mari texted back immediately. Are you sure you know how they get? I looked at the invitation again. I wasn't going for the cake. I wasn't going for the reunion. I wasn't even going for revenge, not yet. That wasn't the plan initially. I just wanted to see the look on their faces when the bill didn't come due, and I wanted to know that I knew. I'm sure I typed back. I need to be there. Why, Mari asked. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. I thought about the years of being the practical one, the invisible one, the one they dismissed while spending my inheritance of patience. Because I thought crimes happen in the dark. I need witnesses, I typed. And now standing in the pool, shivering as the water soaked into the marrow of my bones, with my mother hissing at me and my sister laughing and Grant Hale looking at me like I was the help, I realized I had gotten exactly what I asked for. I had witnesses, hundreds of them, and every single one of them was recording. I wiped a streak of mascara from my cheek, looked up at Grant, and let the cold water harden something inside me that had been soft for far too long. They wanted a show. Fine. I was going to give them one. To understand the full weight of that moment in the water, we have to go back to the beginning of the day. We have to rewind to the moment my tires crunched over the gravel of the long, winding driveway 6 hours earlier. The estate sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, a sprawling limestone beast of a house that radiated old money. It was the kind of place that had a name, not an address. The Harrow House. My parents called it the family estate, a rebrand they had aggressively market-tested on their friends for the last 3 years. As I pulled up to the iron gates, I saw the security detail I had hired. 2 men in dark suits stood by the keypad. To my parents, they were just hired muscle, a necessary accessory for a high society event. To me, they were employees of a private security firm my holding company retained for asset protection. I rolled down the window. The guard on the left, a man named Miller, whom I'd spoken to on the phone 3 times that week regarding the perimeter sensors, looked at me. He didn't salute, that would have been too obvious, but he gave a subtle, sharp nod. He checked a clipboard that I knew contained only names I had approved. "Welcome in, Ms. Parker," he said. His tone was different than it would be for the other guests. It was deferential to authority, not just wealth. "Thank you, Miller. Keep the south gate clear for the vendors," I said quietly. "Understood, ma'am." I drove through. That was the first test. I needed to see if the machine was running. My parents thought this wedding was running on magic and their own sheer force of personality. They didn't realize it was running on a logistics framework I had built brick by brick. I parked my 4-year-old sedan around the back away from the valet stand, where the Bentleys and G-Wagons were already starting to accumulate. Walking toward the main house, I slipped into my role. It was a physical transformation. I rounded my shoulders, slightly softened my gaze, and adopted the neutral, pleasant expression of someone who is happy just to be invited. The house manager, Arthur, was waiting by the service entrance. Arthur was a professional in his 60s who had managed estates for actual royalty. He tolerated my parents because the paycheck signed by JP Estates LLC was immaculate and on time. When he saw me, his posture straightened imperceptibly. He didn't bow, but he held the door with a gravity that spoke volumes. "Ms. Parker," he murmured. "The grounds are ready. The staff has been briefed on the sensitivities of the host arrangement." "Thank you, Arthur," I said, keeping my voice flat. "And my parents?" "They are in the great hall," Arthur said, a flicker of pained amusement in his eyes. Receiving. Receiving was the right word. I walked into the great hall and stopped in the shadow of a massive archway. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were standing in the center of the room beneath a chandelier that cost more than their combined annual income. They looked radiant. They looked like they belonged. My father was gesturing grandly at the hand-painted ceiling frescoes explaining their history to a group of Grant's venture capital friends, as if he had commissioned them himself. "Yes, we've tried to keep the restoration faithful," he was saying, swirling a glass of scotch he hadn't paid for. "It's a labor of love, really, maintaining a legacy like this." I felt a cold prickle of irritation, but I pushed it down. This was the deal. I provided the stage. They provided the clown show. I stepped into the light. "Hello, Mother. Hello, Father." The conversation circle broke. My mother turned her eyes, scanning me from head to toe. She frowned at my dress, a simple, elegant sheath that I had chosen specifically to be unmemorable. "Judith," she said, her voice dropping an octave to convey disappointment. "You're here, finally." "I'm on time, Mother," she sighed, turning back to the guests with a bright fake smile. "Everyone, this is our other daughter, Judith. She's the independent one." One of the men, a slick-haired investor with a tie that was too shiny, raised an eyebrow. "Independent? What line of work are you in, Judith?" Before I could answer, my father clamped a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Oh, Judith is still figuring life out," he boomed, laughing as if it were a charming quirk. "She's a free spirit. Dabbles in computers, doesn't she? We keep telling her she should come work for the family, help manage the estate, but she insists on doing it the hard way." The irony was so dense it almost had a flavor, metallic, bitter. I was the only one managing the estate. I was the only reason the lights were on. But I just smiled, a tight, thin expression. "I like the quiet life," I said. "Well, someone has to keep us grounded." The investor chuckled, losing interest immediately. He turned back to my father. "Now, Richard, tell me about this wine cellar Grant was mentioning." I drifted away. This was the pattern. Public humiliation drip-fed in small, palatable doses. They didn't just want to elevate Sloane. They needed to lower me to create the contrast. A golden child shines brighter if she's standing next to a shadow. I made my way up to the bridal suite. If the Great Hall was a stage, the bridal suite was a war room. Sloane was sitting at a vanity surrounded by a phalanx of bridesmaids in matching silk robes. The air smelled of hairspray and expensive champagne. When I entered, the chatter died down. Sloane spun around in her chair. She looked breathtaking, I had to give her that. But her eyes were hard. "You're late," she snapped. "I'm early, actually," I said. "I wanted to check on the catering setup." "God, you're always so obsessed with the help," Sloane groaned, rolling her eyes at her friends. "Judith thinks she's the wedding planner. It's her way of feeling involved." The bridesmaids giggled. I recognized a few of them from high school girls who used to copy my homework and then ignore me in the cafeteria. "Just making sure things run smoothly, Sloane," I said calmly. Sloane stood up and walked over to me, scrutinizing my dress again. She reached out and plucked at the fabric of my sleeve. "Is this off the rack?" It looks sturdy. It's comfortable, I said. Right, comfortable. Sloane smirked. That's very you, practical. I suppose when you don't have a man like Grant providing a certain lifestyle, you have to prioritize utility over beauty. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be overheard. Look, Jude, I know this must be hard for you. Watching me get all this, the house, the man, the money, just try not to look so bitter in the photos. Okay, it brings down the aesthetic. I looked at her. I looked at the diamond earrings she was wearing, a gift from Grant that I knew for a fact had been purchased on a credit card my father had opened in my grandmother's name before she died. I'm not bitter, Sloane, I said. I'm just observant. Whatever. She dismissed me with a wave of her hand. Go get me a mimosa, and make sure it's the good champagne, not the stuff we're serving the vendors. I left the room. I didn't get the mimosa. Instead, I went to find the one person I hadn't properly assessed yet, the groom. I found Grant Hale on the terrace holding court with a group of his boys. Grant was the kind of man who had failed upward his entire life. He had a jawline that inspired confidence and a resume that inspired lawsuits. He was currently the CEO of a tech incubator called Nebula, which, as far as I could tell from my due diligence, burned cash to produce PowerPoint presentations. Judith, he called out when he saw me. He detached himself from the group and sauntered over. He had that loose-limbed confidence of a man who believes he is the main character. Good to see you. Great venue, right? Your parents really outdid themselves. It's a beautiful property, I said. Incredible. I was just telling the guys. Grant lowered his voice, leaning in on the stone railing. We're thinking of leveraging the equity in this place for the next round of funding. Your dad seems open to it. Put the assets to work, right? My stomach dropped. My father was promising to leverage a house he didn't own to fund a company that didn't work. It was a fraud lasagna. Is that so? I asked, feigning ignorance. I thought the board at Nebula was strict about asset backing. Grant blinked. It was a micro-expression of confusion. The board? Oh well, you know how it is. Boards are guidance. But ownership structure is where the real power is. I've got the investors eating out of my hand. I see, I said. And the cap table. You're comfortable with the dilution. He froze for a second. That was a specific question. Too specific for the independent freelancer sister. But his arrogance bridged the gap. He assumed I was just repeating words I'd heard on the news. It's all under control, Judith, he said with a patronizing pat on my arm. Complex stuff, high finance. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. You just enjoy the party. I watched him walk back to his friends. I watched my father approach him a moment later. And then I saw it, the image that seared itself into my brain. My father, a man who had terrorized our household with his temper and his ego, bowed his head slightly to Grant. He laughed too hard at Grant's joke. He touched Grant's elbow with a desperation that was palpable. My father kept calling him Sir. I stood there gripping the cold stone railing, watching the two of them. I kept wondering how long it would take before Grant realized who was actually signing his checks. The cocktail hour bled into the reception setup. The humiliations continued, methodical and relentless. At the family table during the salad course, my mother made a point of rearranging the seating chart loudly, so I was placed next to an elderly aunt, who was hard of hearing rather than with the young professionals. Judith doesn't really have much in common with your crowd, Grant, she had announced to the table. She always chooses work over family. We barely see her. It's tragic, really, how isolated she's become. She said this while slicing into a filet mignon that cost $60 a plate, paid for by the daughter she was calling isolated. She said this while wearing a diamond tennis bracelet I had bought back from a pawn shop 2 years ago, so she wouldn't face legal action. I sat there cutting my lettuce, and I felt the old urge to flee. My car was just down the hill. I could leave. I could disappear. I had the money, the resources, the skills to vanish, and never speak to these people again. Why was I staying? I looked around the tent. I saw the vendors, the servers, the bartenders, the lighting technicians. They were working hard efficiently because they respected the contract. They respected the entity that paid them. I remembered the moment 5 years ago when I decided I would never beg for love again. It was my college graduation. My parents hadn't come because Sloane had a crisis, a breakup with a boyfriend whose name they couldn't even remember now. I had sat in the stadium alone holding my diploma, and I realized that waiting for them to change was a form of self-harm. I wasn't here for revenge. Not really. I was here for freedom. The only way to truly leave was to burn the bridge so thoroughly that there was no way back across. I pulled out my phone under the table. I opened my encrypted messaging app and found the thread with Mari, my attorney and COO. Mari was the only person in the world who knew the whole truth. She was currently sitting in a makeshift command center in the guest cottage monitoring the escrow accounts. Status, I typed. "Everything is staged," Mari replied instantly. "The documents are printed. The board rep is on site. He's at table 12 blending in nicely. We are green on your command. If they cross the line," I typed, "we end it tonight." "Define the line," Mari asked. I didn't have to wait long for the definition. It happened an hour later. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. The band had started playing upbeat jazz. The guests were mingling by the pool, drinks in hand. Sloane found me. She was flanked by her bridesmaids and a videographer she had hired specifically to capture candid moments for her social media. "Jude, come here," she called out, waving me over to the pool's edge. "We're doing a sister shot." I hesitated. My instincts were screaming at me. But the cameras were rolling and my mother was watching from a nearby table with a warning glare. "Don't make a scene." I walked over. Sloane wrapped her arm around my waist. She smelled of expensive perfume and too much wine. "Smile, Jude," she whispered through her teeth. "Look like you love me." The photographer snapped away. "Great. Now let's get something fun. Maybe a little action shot." Sloane giggled. "Oh, I know." She shifted her weight. It happened in slow motion, but also all at once. She hooked her leg behind mine. It wasn't a stumble. It was a calculated leverage move. She shoved my shoulder hard, shouting, "Oops!" in a voice that was too loud, too theatrical. I tipped backward. I saw the sky. I saw the smirk on her face before the water took me. I hit the water hard. The cold was a shock, but the sound was worse. As I surfaced, gasping, wiping the chlorine from my eyes, I heard it. Laughter. Not just Sloane. The bridesmaids. The guests. Even Grant. They were all laughing. It was a joke. I was the prop in their scene of carefree joy. The clumsy sister. The wet dog at the garden party. I treaded water, my dress heavy and clinging to my legs. I looked at the edge of the pool. My parents were there now. "Oh, honestly," my mother sighed loud enough for me to hear. She turned to my father. "Get her a towel before she drips on the limestone." "Judith," my father barked. "Pull yourself together. Are you going to ruin this?" They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't offer a hand. They were worried about the limestone. They were worried about the vibe. I looked at Sloane. She was checking the display on the videographer's camera to make sure they got the shot. She looked delighted. That was the line. Something snapped in my chest. It wasn't a loud crack. It was the quiet click of a lock engaging. The fear evaporated. The shame evaporated. All that was left was a cold mathematical clarity. No more private pain, I thought. If they want a performance, fine. I'll give them one. I swam to the stairs. I didn't rush. I moved with deliberate, heavy strokes. I climbed out of the pool water, cascading off me, pooling around my feet. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at Sloane. I walked past them, my head high, leaving a trail of wet footprints across the expensive patio. "Where are you going?" my mother hissed. I didn't answer. I walked straight into the house, past the staring staff, and into the library on the ground floor. I locked the door behind me. I pulled out my phone. It was wet, but it was waterproof. I dialed Mari. Do it, I said. Copy that, Mari said. Her voice was sharp professional. I'm coming to the library now. I have the package. I stood in the center of the library, dripping water onto the Persian rug that I had bought at an auction in Vienna 3 years ago. I looked at the books on the shelves, books I had collected. This was my house. This was my sanctuary. And they had turned it into a circus. A moment later, there was a knock at the side door that connected to the service corridor. I opened it. Mari slipped in, carrying a slim leather portfolio. She looked at my soaked dress, her eyes narrowing. They pushed you, she asked. Sloan, I said. And they laughed. Mari set the portfolio on the mahogany desk. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a notarized letter of ownership summary tracing the trust to the holding LLC to the corporation. The second was a property deed summary clear as day, owner JP Estates LLC, sole member Judith Parker. The third was a ledger of all escrow payments made to the vendors for the event. The board representative, I asked. Mr. Henderson, Mari said. He's currently at the bar. He's ready to corroborate. He's been instructed to step in only if you signal. I walked over to the desk. I looked at the papers. They were just paper, but they were heavier than lead. They were the end of my family. They thought my silence meant weakness, I whispered, tracing the signature line on the deed. I looked up at Mari, and for the first time that day I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. They forgot. I said, that silence is also how you load a weapon. You need dry clothes, Mari said gently. No. I said, turning back to the door that led to the garden. I want them to see the water. I want them to remember exactly what they did right before the world falls apart. I unlocked the library door. The music outside had stopped. The speeches were about to begin. I was ready. I walked back into the reception tent, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the silence of anticipation. It was the awkward, stifled quiet of people trying to ignore a train wreck. My dress was still clinging to me, dark and heavy with water. My hair was plastered to my skull. I wasn't wearing shoes anymore. I had left them by the library door, so my bare feet made no sound on the polished dance floor. I stopped at the edge of the crowd. Up on the small stage, bathed in a spotlight that seemed aggressive in the twilight, my father was holding a microphone. He was flushed, his tie loosened, riding the high of a captive audience. Sloan and Grant were seated at the sweetheart table behind him, looking like royalty. Sloan was retouching her lipstick, utterly unbothered by the fact that she had just assaulted her sister. And that's the thing about the Parkers, my father boomed, his voice echoing slightly too loud through the speakers. We strive for excellence. Sloan has always been the star, the one who reaches for the sky, and she found a man who can fly there with her. He raised his glass to Grant, who gave a smug, practiced salute to the crowd. The guests applauded politely. I saw eyes darting toward me, then quickly away. They saw the wet dress. They saw the shivering. But they followed the social contract, pretend everything is fine. And of course, my father continued, chuckling as if he were about to tell a beloved family anecdote, we have Judith, our grounding wire, the spare tire, you might say. A ripple of laughter went through the tent. It wasn't malicious from everyone. Some people laughed just to break the tension, but it cut. Judith is still finding her way, he went on, warming to the theme. She's the independent one, which is usually code for unemployable, right? He winked at Grant. Grant laughed. Sloan laughed. That was it. The last bit of fear I had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I didn't feel the chill of the water anymore. I felt like I was burning. I stepped into the light. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a glass. I just walked to the center of the floor right in front of the stage. My sudden movement caught the attention of the front row, and the hush spread backward like a wave. My father faltered, seeing me standing there dripping wet, looking like a swamp creature crashing a gala. Judith, he said, his voice dropping into that warning tone he used when I was a child. Sit down. You're making a scene. No, I said. I didn't have a microphone, but the acoustics of the tent were good, and the silence was so absolute that my voice carried to the back tables. "I'm not sitting down," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued me for years. "And I'm not making a scene. I'm making a correction." "This isn't the time," my mother hissed from her table, half rising. "Look at you. You're a mess. Go change." "I will," I said. "But first we need to clarify a few things. You just called me the spare. You just told 300 people that I'm unemployable and figuring life out." "It was a joke, Judith," Sloane called out from the sweetheart table, rolling her eyes. "God, you have no sense of humor." "Let's test that," I said. I turned my gaze to my father. "You've spent the last 6 hours and the last 10 years telling everyone about the family estate, about how the Parkers have owned this land for generations." My father's smile was frozen, a rictus of panic. "Judith, enough." "This house isn't yours, Dad," I said. The words hung there. He laughed, a nervous barking sound. "Of course it is. Don't be ridiculous. It's in the trust." "It is in a trust," I agreed. "JP Estates, LLC. That's the entity on the deed. You told everyone JP stood for Joint Parker. You assumed it was a family holding." "It is," he snapped, losing patience. "It's a paperwork technicality." "It's not a technicality," I said. "I'm the only member of JP Estates, LLC. I bought this property 4 years ago. I pay the taxes. I pay the insurance. I pay Arthur's salary." I pointed to the house manager who was standing by the bar. He didn't look away. He nodded once, solemn and clear. "This isn't the family estate," I said, my voice rising just enough to be heard over the sudden murmur of the crowd. "This is my home. You are guests, and you are very bad guests." My mother was standing now, clutching her napkin. You ungrateful little, how dare you? You're lying. You can't afford this." I didn't answer her. I turned to Grant. He was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and pity, like I was having a mental breakdown. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, preparing to play the hero. "Okay, Judith," he said, his voice smooth, using his CEO tone. "Let's calm down. You're obviously upset about the pool thing. We can talk about this house fantasy later. Okay, let's get you some help." "Fantasy?" I asked. I signaled to the side of the tent. Mari stepped out. She wasn't wearing a party dress. She was wearing a charcoal gray suit, and she looked like an executioner. She walked straight to me and handed me the portfolio. "Grant," I said, opening the folder. "You're the CEO of Nebula, right?" "You know I am," he said, looking at the guests, inviting them to share in his exasperation. "And who owns Nebula?" I asked. He blinked. "The investors. The board. It's a complex structure, Judith, I told you." "It's not complex," I interrupted. "It's a holding company, Vantage Point Holdings. They own 51% of the voting stock. They appointed the board. They appointed you." "So," he said, his confidence wavering slightly, "I answer to the board." I pulled a document from the folder. "I am Vantage Point Holdings." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. Grant's face went slack. He looked at the paper I was holding up, a simple organizational chart with my signature at the bottom. That's not possible," he stammered. "I've met the board rep, Mr. Henderson." "Mr. Henderson," I called out. From table 12, a gray-haired man in a tuxedo stood up. He was the man my father had been trying to impress earlier. He held his glass up. "Ms. Parker is the majority shareholder and chairwoman of the board," Henderson said, his voice projecting clearly. "She appointed me to handle the day-to-day oversight so she could remain anonymous. But make no mistake, she signs the checks." Grant looked at Henderson, then at me. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like he might faint. The arrogance, the CEO swagger, the condescension, it all vanished. He wasn't looking at his sister-in-law anymore. He was looking at his boss, and he had just watched his boss get shoved into a pool while he laughed. "Judith," Grant whispered. It was a plea. I didn't let him finish. I turned back to my parents. They looked small. They looked like they were shrinking under the weight of the truth. And finally, I said, pulling the last document, the wedding. Judith, stop, my mother begged. She was crying now, real tears this time. Please don't do this. You wanted a 6-figure wedding, I said. You wanted the Parkers to look like royalty, but you didn't have the money. You told everyone the foundation was covering it. I held up the ledger. I am the foundation. The flowers my money. The catering my money. The band playing right now. The band leader, realizing what was happening, awkwardly stopped the drummer who had been keeping a low beat. The music died. My money, I said into the dead air. Every single cent of this dream wedding came from me. I set up the escrow because I knew you would stiff the vendors if I didn't. My father was shaking. His face was purple. We raised you, he shouted, his voice cracking. We gave you everything. We raised you to be a Parker. No, I said softly. You raised me to be useful. You raised me to fix your mistakes and hide your debts. You never raised me to be loved. I looked at Sloane. She was still sitting at the table, but she had slumped. She looked like a child whose ice cream had fallen in the dirt. She wasn't the golden child anymore. She was just a girl in a dress she hadn't paid for, marrying a man who didn't own his own job at a party thrown by the sister she tormented. You pushed me into my own pool, I said to her. I let that sink in. You pushed me, I repeated, scanning the crowd, making eye contact with the bridesmaids who had giggled into a pool at my own house, during a wedding I paid for, to celebrate a man I technically employ. I saw the realization hit the guests. I saw the cameras go down. It wasn't drama anymore. It wasn't a reality show catfight. It was math. Brutal, undeniable math. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. I wasn't the victim. I was the landlord, the employer, and the bank. I'm done, I said. The show is over. I turned to Miller, the head of security, who had moved silently to the edge of the dance floor. Miller, I said. Ms. Parker. The party is over, I said. Please escort Richard Eleanor and Sloane Parker off the property. They are trespassing. Judith, my mother screamed. You can't kick us out. It's the wedding. The wedding is finished, I said, cold. The groom has some thinking to do about his employment status. And the bride? I looked at Sloane one last time. The bride needs to learn that you don't bite the hand that feeds you, especially when that hand owns the roof over your head. And the guests? Miller asked. The guests can finish their drinks, I said, but the Parkers leave, now. Miller signaled his team. 2 large men stepped onto the stage. My father tried to puff up his chest, but he was deflated. He looked at the crowd, desperate for an ally, but no one moved. No one said a word. They were too stunned, too embarrassed to be associated with the fraud I had just exposed. Sloane stood up, grabbing her skirts. I'm not leaving. This is my night. It was never your night, Sloane, I said. It was my charity. One of the guards gently but firmly took her elbow. She shrieked a raw, ugly sound that tore through the luxury tent. My mother was sobbing into my father's shoulder as they were led away down the steps past the tables of silent people. I watched them go. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a massive, crushing weight lift off my chest. I looked at Grant. He was still standing there alone at the sweetheart table. He looked terrified. We'll talk on Monday, Grant, I said. Bring your resignation letter, or don't. I haven't decided if I want to fire you or just demote you to something you're actually qualified for. I dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that echoed like a gavel strike. I turned and walked away. I walked back through the crowd, leaving wet footprints on the dance floor. The guests parted like the Red Sea. No one whispered. No one laughed. The band didn't start playing again. The perfect wedding had collapsed into whispers, but I didn't hear them. I walked out of the tent into the cool night air and toward the house that was finally undeniably mine. The adrenaline crash didn't hit me immediately. Instead, a strange, hyper-lucid calm settled over me as I walked back into the main house. The heavy oak doors shut behind me, muting the chaotic murmur of the confused guests outside, but they couldn't block out the voices of my family. They hadn't gone quietly. Of course they hadn't. I was crossing the foyer toward the kitchen when the side door burst open. Miller, my head of security, was trying to block the path, but my father shoved past him with a strength born of pure, desperate rage. My mother and Sloane were right behind him, their faces smeared with running makeup, looking like tragic figures from a collapsed dynasty. "You think you can just walk away?" My father roared, his voice echoing off the marble floors. "After what you just did?" Miller stepped forward, his hand moving to his belt, but I held up a hand. "It's okay, Miller. Give us 2 minutes. Then remove them." My father marched up to me, his finger jabbing toward my face. "You petulant, jealous little child. You ruined your sister's life. You humiliated us in front of the entire Eastern Seaboard's investment community. Do you have any idea the damage you've done?" "I didn't do the damage, Richard," I said, using his first name for the first time in my life. It felt strange on my tongue, but right. "I just turned on the lights. The rot was already there." "We are your family," my mother shrieked. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Family protects each other. We kept your secrets. We tolerated your eccentricities, and this is how you repay us, by evicting us." I looked down at her hand on my arm. It was a claw. "You didn't keep my secrets, Mother. You ignored my existence until you needed something. And I'm not evicting you from a home. I'm removing trespassers from a corporate asset." "I'll sue you," Sloane spat. She wasn't crying anymore. She was vibrating with hate. "I'll sue you for emotional distress. I'll tell everyone you're crazy. I'll say you faked those documents." "Go ahead," I said, my voice dropping to a register that was almost bored. "The deed is public record. The escrow trails are audited. And as for my sanity, I'm the only one here who isn't living in a hallucination." I pulled my arm free from my mother's grip. "Here are the terms. Listen closely, because I'm only saying them once." They fell silent, not out of respect, but out of shock that I was giving orders. "1," I said, holding up a finger. "The vendors stay. The guests can stay and finish the food and drink I paid for. I won't have innocent people punished for your incompetence. 2. You leave the property immediately. If you return, you will be arrested. Miller has the authority to press charges on behalf of the LLC. "Judith." My father started, his tone shifting from anger to a wheedling bargaining tone. 3. I cut him off. "I am cutting off the credit cards, the allowances, the access to the trust, all of it. You're on your own. You wanted to be big shots, go earn it." Miller stepped forward again. "Time's up." My father looked at me, searching for the daughter who used to fix his tie and balance his checkbook. He didn't find her. He found a stranger with wet hair and a backbone of steel. He spat on the floor near my feet, a petty, powerless gesture, and turned to leave. Sloane and my mother followed, wailing fresh protests as the security team heralded them out the door. I didn't watch them go. I turned and walked toward the library, needing a moment of silence. But I wasn't alone yet. "Judith?" The voice was tentative. I turned to see Grant standing in the archway of the dining room. He wasn't being escorted out. He wasn't a Parker after all. He looked like a man who had survived a plane crash only to realize he was stranded on a desert island. He was holding his tie in his hand. "Grant," I said. "I thought you'd be chasing the bride." He let out a short, dry laugh. I think I'm done chasing things I don't understand." He walked into the room, keeping a respectful distance. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since we'd met. "You own Nebula. You actually own it." "Vantage Point Holdings owns it," I corrected. "I own Vantage Point." "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation, it was genuine bewilderment. "Would you have listened?" I asked. "Or would you have patted me on the head and told me not to worry my pretty little mind about high finance?" He winced. He remembered the conversation on the terrace. He rubbed his face with his hand. I'm an idiot. Yes, I said. You are. But you're also a victim in a way. He looked up surprised. They sold you a lie, Grant, I told him. They sold you the Parker legacy. They told you this estate was theirs to leverage. They let you believe you were marrying into a dynasty that could fund your next 3 rounds of capital. They were going to bleed you dry. The realization hit him physically. He staggered back a step, leaning against a side table. I saw the gears turning. He realized that the arrogant in-laws weren't just difficult, they were con artists, and he had been the mark. They were using me, he whispered. We were all using each other, I said. You wanted their status. They wanted your potential IPO. I just wanted to be left alone. He looked at me, and I saw a flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was a survivor, I'd give him that. He straightened up, adjusting his jacket. Look, Judith, about the company. I know this is awkward, but I'm good at what I do. The product is solid. If we could just sit down professional to professional. I raised a hand, stopping him cold. Grant, I said softly, I don't want your pitch. And I don't want you. You stood by that pool and laughed while your fiancé assaulted me. You watched them treat me like garbage for months, and you didn't say a word because it was convenient for you. I was trying to fit in, he pleaded. That's the problem, I said. I don't need people who fit in. I need people who stand up. You can keep your job for now because I don't fire people on weekends. But don't think for a second that we're partners. We're not family. We're employer and employee, and right now, you're on thin ice. He nodded, swallowing hard. He turned to leave, his shoulders slumped. He had walked in as a groom and a CEO. He was walking out as a single man on probation. I left him there and went to the kitchen. The swinging doors burst open to reveal a scene of high anxiety. The catering staff was frozen. The head chef, a frantic man named Marco, was pacing. When he saw me, he stopped. Ms. Parker, he stammered. We saw the security, the family leaving. We were told to stop service. No, I said, my voice firm but kind. Do not stop. The guests are still hungry. The bar is still open. But Marco hesitated, wringing his hands on his apron. With the family gone, the payment. Marco, I said, who signed your contract? He paused, thinking. The trust. JP Estates. And who signed the check that cleared last Tuesday? You did, ma'am. Exactly, I said. My money is still good. My contract is still valid. You aren't working for Richard and Eleanor. You're working for me. And I pay my debts. The tension in the room snapped like a cut wire. Shoulders dropped, breaths were released. A sous chef actually smiled. Thank you, Ms. Parker, Marco said, visibly relieved. We've had issues with clients like your parents before. We were worried. I know, I said. That's why I structured it this way. I protect my people. I walked out of the kitchen as the clang of pots and the shout of orders resumed. It was a beautiful sound, the sound of competence. I realized then that this was what power was actually for. It wasn't for bullying or posturing or pushing people into pools. It was for the ability to stand between the chaos of the world and the people trying to do their jobs and say, I've got this. I made my way to the side terrace. Miller met me there. They're off the property, he reported. They tried to stop at the gate and talk to some guests who were leaving early. And your mother tried to spin it, Miller said, a hint of a smirk on his face. She was screaming that you were having a mental breakdown, that you were off your meds, that the documents were forgeries. Did anyone buy it? Miller shook his head. Ma'am, half those guests saw the water dripping off your dress while you calmly explained corporate tax law. The other half are already gossiping about the deed you showed on the projector. The lie didn't stick. The facts were too loud. I nodded, looking out at the driveway. The taillights of my parents' car had long since faded, but the guests were still there, clustered in groups, whispering, looking at the house with new eyes. They weren't looking at a fairy tale anymore. They were looking at a fortress. And for the first time in my life, the fortress wasn't keeping me trapped inside. It was keeping the monsters out. The last taillight faded down the winding drive around 2 in the morning. The catering trucks had packed up and rumbled away an hour before that, leaving only the faint scent of diesel and stale champagne in the driveway. The security team, efficient to the last, had done a final sweep of the perimeter before Miller gave me a nod and withdrew to the gatehouse. I was finally alone. I sat in the center of the great hall on a velvet settee that my mother had claimed was an antique from the French Revolution, but was actually a high-end reproduction I'd ordered from a catalog in North Carolina. The house was quiet, not the tense, held-breath quiet that usually permeated the rooms when my parents were home, waiting for someone to drop a glass or say the wrong thing. This was a deep structural silence. It was the sound of a building that was finally allowed to settle into its own foundation. I looked down at my hands resting on my knees. For the first time since I was 16 years old, they weren't shaking. The low-level hum of anxiety, the constant subconscious bracing for impact was gone. It had vanished the moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind my family. I should have felt triumphant. That's what the movies tell you. Revenge looks like a victory lap, a glass of wine raised to the ruins of your enemies, a cinematic smirk. But I didn't feel like a victor. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean like the inside of a pumpkin. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving behind a clarity that was almost painful. I realized then that I hadn't just exposed them. I hadn't just protected my assets or humiliated my bullies. I had done something far more permanent. I had let go. For years, even while I built my secret empire, even while I protected myself with LLCs and trusts, a small, stupid part of me had been waiting for them to see me, waiting for my father to say he was proud without adding a caveat, waiting for my mother to ask about my day without looking for an angle, waiting for Sloane to be a sister instead of a competitor. Tonight I hadn't killed my family. I had killed the fantasy that they would ever change. I had finally accepted the truth that had been staring me in the face for a decade. They were incapable of loving me, because they were incapable of seeing anyone who couldn't be spent. I stood up and walked through the dark house. My bare feet on the stone floors felt grounding. I went to the study where Mari had left the final stack of paperwork on the desk before she left. It was a list of next steps. A grim administrative autopsy of the night. I sat down and pulled the Mont Blanc pen from its holder, my pen on my desk, and began to work. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was just housekeeping. First, the trespass notices. I drafted the email to Miller's firm authorizing a permanent ban on Richard Eleanor and Sloane Parker from the premises. If they stepped foot on the gravel, they would be arrested. No warnings, no family discussions. Second, the locks. I called the locksmith service on the emergency vendor list. They would be here at 8:00 a.m. to rekey the entire estate. The keys my parents carried in their pockets, symbols of status they loved to flash at dinner parties, were now just jagged pieces of useless metal. Third, the announcement. I stared at the blank screen of my laptop. For years I had hidden behind the anonymity of the trust. I had let the world believe I was the practical, boring sister while I ran a corporation from the shadows. I had done it to protect myself from their greed, but they were gone now. The threat was neutralized. I didn't want to be invisible anymore. Invisibility had been a survival tactic, but tonight I had survived. Now I wanted to live. I typed out a brief memo to the board of Vantage Point Holdings, authorizing a press release for Monday morning. Judith Parker was stepping forward as the chairwoman. No more proxies, no more Mr. Henderson. If the world wanted to know who built the machine, they would know it was me. I closed the laptop. The finality of the sound echoed in the room. I walked out through the French doors to the patio. The sun was just starting to bleed into the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray. The air was cool and salt-heavy from the ocean below. I walked to the edge of the pool. The water was glass still. The pool lights were off, so the surface looked like a sheet of black obsidian. There were no ripples left from where I had fallen. The chlorine smell had dissipated, replaced by the clean scent of the morning tide. I stood on the exact spot where Sloane had shoved me. I remembered the feeling of the water rushing into my nose, the burning of the mascara, the sound of their laughter warping through the liquid. They had thought that push was the punchline. They had thought the water was a place of humiliation. They were wrong. The water was a baptism. I looked at my reflection in the dark surface. I didn't see the spare anymore. I didn't see the practical one. I saw a woman who had built a fortress out of silence and then used it to crush a lie. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally felt like it belonged to me. They pushed me in to drown me, I whispered to the empty yard, my voice steady and strong. All they did was prove I don't live on their land anymore. I turned my back on the pool and walked back toward the house. My house. The sun was coming up, and I had a company to run. Judith stood tall in the end, proving that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it is simply the quiet work of building a better life. If you enjoyed Judith's calculated victory, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments, would you have evicted them immediately or waited until the cake was cut? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.